3 days after Emily Carter buried the only man who had truly loved her unconditionally, her husband asked for a divorce. There was no warning, no screaming match, no long emotional conversation in the kitchen at midnight. Just a stack of papers placed quietly on a dining table while the smell of funeral flowers still filled the apartment. Emily remembered staring at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the page while her hands shook so badly she could barely breathe. Less than 72 hours earlier, she had been standing in cold rain beside her grandfather's grave, believing her husband was the one person she still had left in the world. But grief has a strange way of revealing people. Sometimes the people closest to you are only loyal to the version of your life that benefits them. 2 months later, Daniel married Vanessa Reed, Emily's closest friend since childhood. The same Vanessa who sat beside her at the funeral. The same Vanessa who held her while she cried herself to sleep after Arthur Bennett died. The same Vanessa who promised her over and over again that she would never abandon her. By the time Emily saw the wedding photographs online, the betrayal had already become the talk of their small Ohio town. People whispered about it in grocery stores, at gas stations, even inside church parking lots after Sunday service. Some blamed Daniel. Some blamed Vanessa. But almost everyone quietly agreed on one thing. Emily Carter had lost everything. Her husband was gone. Her best friend was gone. And the only family member she had left was buried beneath 6 feet of wet earth beside an old maple tree. What nobody knew was that Arthur Bennett had spent 40 years hiding a secret large enough to destroy every single person who betrayed his granddaughter. For most of his life, Arthur looked like a man the world had forgotten. He drove a rusty pickup truck with peeling paint on the doors. He lived alone in a tiny farmhouse outside town where the roof leaked every winter and the porch creaked under your feet. His clothes were old. His boots were worn down. The local diner waitress used to refill his coffee out of pity because she assumed he couldn't afford another cup. Daniel certainly believed that. In fact, Daniel used to laugh whenever Emily insisted on helping her grandfather fix things around the house. He once told her, "Your grandfather spent his whole life working himself into the ground and still ended up with nothing." Emily never argued back. She simply smiled and continued defending the old man who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. Arthur Bennett was the kind of man who spoke very little but noticed everything. He noticed the impatience in Daniel's voice whenever money became part of the conversation. He noticed the way Vanessa's eyes wandered around expensive restaurants whenever wealthy couples walked by. He noticed how differently people treated him after deciding he was poor. And over time, Arthur began understanding something most people never realize until it is too late. The quickest way to discover someone's true character is to let them believe you have nothing they can gain from you. The morning after the funeral, Emily sat alone inside her apartment staring at old family photographs spread across the floor. There was one picture she could not stop looking at. She was 9 years old in it, sitting beside Arthur on a fishing dock with missing front teeth and tangled hair, while Arthur smiled proudly beside her, holding a tiny bluegill fish they had caught together. She remembered that day clearly because Arthur had told her something she never forgot. He said, "Money changes people long before they ever touch it." At the time she thought he meant greed. Years later she would realize he meant something far worse. Daniel walked into the apartment carrying 2 coffees and acting strangely calm. Emily assumed he was exhausted from the funeral arrangements. But then he sat across from her without speaking. No comfort, no sympathy, no warmth. Just silence heavy enough to make her stomach tighten. Finally, he slid the divorce papers across the table and said something Emily would replay in her head for the next year of her life. "I can't keep drowning beside you." That was it. No apology. No hesitation. 20 minutes later, he walked out carrying 2 suitcases while Emily collapsed onto the kitchen floor, trying to understand how a marriage could disappear faster than a storm passing through town. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, Emily blamed herself. People usually do when betrayal arrives quietly. She wondered if she had become too emotionally distant after Arthur's illness. She wondered if Daniel had fallen out of love months earlier while she was too distracted caring for her grandfather to notice. But then strange details started surfacing one after another. Daniel had already rented a downtown apartment before filing for divorce. Vanessa suddenly stopped answering calls. Mutual friends became uncomfortable around her. And then came the photographs. Daniel and Vanessa smiling together at a beachfront resort in Florida less than 8 weeks after Arthur's funeral. Emily stared at those images late into the night, feeling something inside her slowly harden. Not anger, not even hatred, just disbelief. The kind that leaves you numb. What happened next would shock the entire town. Because exactly 91 days after Arthur Bennett died, a black luxury car pulled into the parking lot outside Emily's apartment building. A man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out holding a leather briefcase and asked for Emily by name. She almost ignored him because she assumed he was another debt collector or insurance representative. Instead, the man introduced himself as Martin Graves, senior attorney for Bennett Holdings Incorporated. Emily had never heard those words before in her life. Bennett Holdings. The name meant nothing to her. But the moment she sat inside Martin's office, the entire reality she thought she understood began falling apart piece by piece. The first thing Martin placed on the table was a photograph. It showed Arthur Bennett standing beside a luxury high-rise building in Chicago sometime during the late 1980s. He wore a tailored suit Emily had never seen before. Standing around him were businessmen and investors shaking his hand. Emily immediately assumed there had been some mistake. Her grandfather hated cities. He barely spent money on himself. He fixed his own plumbing using duct tape because he refused to hire contractors. But then Martin opened a folder containing property records, investment accounts, company shares, oil royalties, and bank statements stretching back nearly 4 decades. Arthur Bennett was worth $18 million. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Not because of the money, because suddenly every conversation she ever had with her grandfather carried a completely different meaning. Arthur Bennett was worth $18 million. And in that single moment inside Martin Graves' office, Emily Carter felt the ground beneath everything she believed in quietly shift. The man she had spent her entire life protecting from judgment, the man her husband mocked as useless, the man her best friend dismissed as irrelevant, was never who anyone thought he was. But what unsettled her even more than the number itself was what Martin revealed next. Arthur had structured everything in a way that prevented simple inheritance. Nothing could be accessed immediately. No funds could be touched. No property could be sold. Everything was locked behind conditions, timelines, and one final sealed instruction that could only be opened after 90 days. Emily sat there trying to process why her grandfather would design something so precise, so deliberate, almost as if he had anticipated the exact shape of the chaos that would follow his death. Outside that office, life continued as if nothing had changed, but for Emily, everything had already fractured. Daniel, however, reacted differently when he eventually learned what had been revealed. It did not take long for information in a small town to travel faster than truth. Within days, Daniel Carter, who had already finalized most of the divorce proceedings, began reaching out again. His tone had changed. His distance disappeared. The same man who once said he could not keep drowning beside her now spoke softly, carefully, as if every word had been rehearsed. He apologized for the divorce. He blamed stress. He blamed timing. He even spoke about grief, as though Arthur's death had affected him deeply. But Emily noticed something she had once ignored. Daniel was not returning because he missed her. He was returning because he had finally understood what he walked away from. Vanessa Reed's behavior shifted as well. The friendship that had once felt like family began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and ego. Daniel and Vanessa, once united in their certainty, started turning on each other. Arguments became frequent, then public, then uncontrollable. Vanessa accused Daniel of using her as a replacement until something better appeared. Daniel accused Vanessa of pushing him too quickly into decisions that destroyed his marriage. What had once looked like a perfect new beginning between them began collapsing into accusations and resentment. And in the middle of all this, Emily said almost nothing. She watched quietly as the two people who betrayed her began revealing what they were without her influence. It was no longer about her. It was about what they were always capable of becoming when consequences finally arrived. 90 days passed slowly, too slowly for Emily, who lived each day between disbelief and exhaustion. During that time, Martin Graves instructed her not to interfere with anything tied to Arthur's estate. No decisions, no contact with Daniel regarding finances, no public statements. Everything was on hold until the final document was opened. That document sat inside a sealed envelope in a secured vault, and according to Arthur's instructions, it would only be read in the presence of all legal parties. Daniel heard about this and immediately insisted on attending. Vanessa, equally anxious, demanded the same. Neither of them fully understood what they were stepping into, but both believed there might still be something left for them to claim. That belief alone was enough to bring them back into Emily's orbit, sitting once again at the edge of a life they had already abandoned. The day the envelope was finally opened, the atmosphere inside the attorney's office carried a weight that none of them spoke about. Daniel sat upright, trying to appear composed. Vanessa avoided eye contact with Emily entirely. Emily herself felt nothing close to anticipation. What she felt instead was fatigue, the kind that comes after too many emotional collapses in too short a time. Martin Graves broke the seal carefully, unfolded Arthur Bennett's final letter, and began reading aloud. The first lines were not about money. They were not about inheritance. They were about people. Arthur wrote that wealth does not change individuals. It reveals them faster than time ever could. He wrote that he had spent decades observing how easily respect disappears when someone is believed to have nothing. And then the letter shifted. Arthur explained that he had known about the growing distance in Emily's marriage long before she admitted it to herself. He had seen the signs in Daniel's behavior, the impatience, the resentment, the subtle shift in how he spoke about success and failure. He had also observed Vanessa's increasing presence in their lives, the way trust was being redirected in quiet, unnoticed ways. According to the letter, Arthur had arranged for private oversight of certain interactions after noticing patterns that concerned him deeply. What he discovered was not just betrayal after his death, but preparation for it before it even happened. And that realization changed everything that followed. What Arthur Bennett discovered was not just betrayal after his death, but preparation for it before it even happened. And that realization changed everything that followed. The room fell silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning inside Martin Graves' office. Emily stared at the letter in Martin's hands, trying to understand what she had just heard. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the floor. Neither of them expected Arthur's words to reach this far into the future. Martin continued reading. Arthur wrote that approximately 8 months before his death, he began noticing conversations that seemed harmless on the surface but troubling when viewed together. Daniel had become increasingly interested in Arthur's finances. Not because Arthur appeared wealthy. Quite the opposite. Daniel seemed fascinated by what he considered Arthur's failures. He repeatedly questioned why the old man had worked so hard throughout his life, yet appeared to have so little to show for it. Arthur found the questions unusual. Most people simply assumed he was poor and moved on. Daniel, however, kept returning to the topic. Then there was Vanessa. Arthur wrote that Vanessa had once been like family. He remembered attending her high school graduation. He remembered helping her repair a flat tire during a snowstorm years earlier. He remembered bringing gifts to her mother when she underwent surgery. Yet over time, he began noticing something in Vanessa that made him uncomfortable. Whenever wealth entered a conversation, her attention sharpened immediately. She paid close attention to expensive homes, successful couples, luxury vacations, and anyone perceived as important. Separately, those observations meant very little. Together, they painted a picture Arthur could not ignore. According to the letter, the moment that changed everything happened 6 months before his death. Arthur had attended a local charity banquet. It was one of the few public events he ever attended. Most people ignored him throughout the evening, assuming he was simply another retired farmer from outside town. Arthur preferred it that way. He spent most of the night quietly observing the room. Then he noticed Daniel and Vanessa standing together near the entrance. At first, there was nothing suspicious about it. They were family friends. They had known each other for years. But Arthur noticed something else. The conversation stopped immediately when Emily approached. Both smiled. Both acted naturally. And yet something about the exchange felt rehearsed. Arthur admitted in his letter that he almost dismissed the feeling entirely. Almost. Weeks later, another incident occurred. Emily canceled dinner with Daniel because Arthur had experienced a minor health scare. She spent the evening helping him recover at the farmhouse. During that time, Daniel claimed he was attending a business networking event in Columbus. Arthur later discovered the event had been canceled days beforehand. At first he said nothing. He simply watched. And the more he watched, the more questions emerged. Questions eventually became concerns. Concerns eventually became suspicions. By then Arthur had reached a decision. If he was wrong, nobody would ever know. If he was right, Emily deserved the truth. That was when he hired a private investigator. The revelation struck the room like a thunderclap. Emily blinked repeatedly. A private investigator? Her grandfather? The quiet old man who spent most afternoons repairing fences and feeding birds outside his farmhouse? The image felt impossible to reconcile with the grandfather she knew. Yet Martin continued reading. Arthur wrote that the investigator spent months documenting patterns, meetings, messages, and timelines. The goal was not revenge. The goal was certainty. Arthur wanted facts, nothing more. What emerged from the investigation disturbed him deeply. Daniel and Vanessa had not suddenly become involved after Arthur's death. Their emotional relationship had begun long before. The report documented secret lunches, private meetings, deleted communications, conversations hidden from Emily. None of the evidence suggested a single impulsive mistake. It suggested planning. The color drained from Emily's face. For years, she had wondered whether she missed warning signs. Now she realized something far more painful. There were warning signs. She simply trusted the wrong people. Across the table, Daniel's jaw tightened. Vanessa remained completely still. Neither interrupted. Neither objected. Neither demanded clarification. Their silence spoke louder than any denial could have. Martin paused briefly before turning to the next page. What came next would prove even more devastating. Because Arthur's investigation uncovered something neither Daniel nor Vanessa realized anyone knew. And unlike the affair itself, this discovery had nothing to do with romance. It had everything to do with money. Months before Arthur's death, Daniel had secretly contacted multiple financial institutions attempting to determine whether Arthur possessed hidden assets. He approached former business associates. He questioned neighbors. He even attempted to access public records connected to properties Arthur once owned decades earlier. At the time, Daniel believed nobody noticed. Arthur noticed. The investigator noticed. And now Emily was hearing every detail for the first time. Suddenly, Daniel's return after the inheritance announcement looked very different. His apologies, his flowers, his emotional messages, his promises, his regret. Every gesture began collapsing beneath the weight of a single possibility. What if Daniel never came back because he loved her? What if he came back because he thought he could still gain access to what Arthur left behind? And if that was true, how much of their marriage had been real in the first place? The answer to that question was waiting inside the remaining pages of Arthur Bennett's final letter. And before the afternoon was over, every person in that office would learn a truth that would permanently alter the course of their lives. The answer to that question was waiting inside the remaining pages of Arthur Bennett's final letter. And before the afternoon was over, every person in that office would learn a truth that would permanently alter the course of their lives. Martin Graves adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Arthur's handwriting remained steady throughout the letter. There was no bitterness in his words. No anger. No desire for revenge. What made the letter unsettling was how calm it was. Arthur wrote like a man describing weather patterns he had observed for years. Every conclusion was supported by patience. Every statement was supported by evidence. Arthur explained that after reviewing the investigator's reports, he came to a painful realization. Emily had spent years building her life around people who valued what she could provide rather than who she was. Daniel valued stability when it benefited him. Vanessa valued friendship when it was convenient. Neither expected their choices to be examined closely. Neither expected consequences beyond Emily's heartbreak. But Arthur believed character revealed itself most clearly when nobody believed they were being watched. The investigator documented dozens of interactions over several months. Some were insignificant. Others were impossible to ignore. There were conversations discussing future plans that did not include Emily. There were messages suggesting Daniel had already emotionally detached from his marriage long before Arthur became seriously ill. There were private discussions about financial struggles, ambitions, frustrations, and opportunities. Then Martin reached a paragraph that caused Daniel to sit forward abruptly. Arthur wrote that one particular conversation stood out above all others. According to the investigator's report, Daniel once told Vanessa that if he ever wanted a different life, Emily would never see it coming because she trusted people too easily. The room became still. Daniel's expression hardened. Emily looked toward him for the first time since the reading began. He said nothing. He couldn't, because denying the statement would only invite further details. Vanessa looked equally uncomfortable. Arthur continued. He wrote that reading those reports was one of the most painful experiences of his life. Not because strangers had disappointed him, but because he knew how deeply Emily loved the people involved. He worried less about his own death and more about what would happen to Emily afterward. That concern ultimately shaped every decision he made regarding his estate. Martin paused again before unfolding another page. This section contained legal instructions. The atmosphere immediately changed. Everyone in the room sensed it. This was what Daniel had been waiting for. This was what Vanessa had hoped for. This was the section connected to the fortune. Arthur explained that his wealth would remain under a trust structure designed specifically to protect Emily from manipulation, coercion, emotional pressure, and financial exploitation. Every asset, every property, every investment, every royalty payment, everything. The entire estate would eventually transfer to Emily. But there was a condition. Martin stopped speaking for several seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then he read the next sentence. Emily Carter would inherit full control of the estate only if she remained completely independent from Daniel Carter in all financial, legal, and marital matters. Daniel's face immediately changed. Arthur had anticipated exactly what might happen if his fortune became public knowledge. If Emily reconciled with Daniel, if she remarried him, if she transferred assets to him, if she provided financial access, the trust would automatically redirect the majority of the estate toward charitable foundations Arthur had established years earlier. Daniel stared at the table. For the first time that afternoon, his confidence disappeared. Arthur had effectively removed money from the equation. The very thing Daniel returned for could never be obtained through Emily. Not now. Not ever. Martin continued reading. Arthur explained that the purpose of the condition was not punishment. It was protection. He believed people deserved second chances. But he also believed actions revealed priorities. If Daniel genuinely loved Emily, he would stay even when there was nothing to gain. If he stayed only for the inheritance, he would eventually leave once access became impossible. Either outcome would provide clarity. Arthur ended that section with a final sentence. Emily, if you are hearing this, then my greatest wish is that you never confuse loneliness with love. The word struck harder than any financial revelation. Emily lowered her head. For a moment, she was no longer sitting inside a law office. She was a little girl again, sitting beside her grandfather on a fishing dock. Listening, learning, trusting, missing him. Across the table, Daniel finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller than before. He claimed everything had been misunderstood. He insisted people could change. He argued that the investigation captured moments without context. He spoke about mistakes, growth, regret, second chances. But something had changed. Not just for Emily. For everyone. The excuses that once sounded convincing now sounded desperate. Vanessa interrupted. What happened next surprised everyone. Years of resentment suddenly surfaced. She accused Daniel of chasing money. Daniel accused Vanessa of encouraging the affair. Vanessa accused him of abandoning Emily before Arthur's funeral. Daniel accused Vanessa of manipulating situations from the beginning. The argument escalated rapidly. Months of hidden frustration exploded into the open. Martin eventually ended the confrontation by asking both individuals to leave. For the first time since Arthur's death, Emily felt strangely calm. Not happy, not relieved, simply clear. The confusion that had haunted her for months finally began disappearing. Because clarity often arrives when illusions collapse. The weeks that followed transformed Emily's life. Not because she became wealthy, but because she stopped chasing answers from people who had already revealed themselves. She moved into Arthur's farmhouse. Most people expected her to sell it immediately. She refused. The old house contained memories money could never replace. Instead, she restored it, room by room, board by board, photograph by photograph. As she sorted through decades of Arthur's belongings, she discovered journals, letters, records, and personal reflections spanning nearly 40 years. Many contained lessons he never spoke aloud. Others documented acts of generosity nobody knew about. Scholarships, medical bills, mortgage payments for struggling families. quiet gifts given without recognition. The deeper Emily looked, the more she understood. Arthur never hid wealth because he feared losing money. He hid it because he wanted to see people clearly. And he had. Within 2 years, Emily established the Arthur Bennett Foundation. Its mission reflected the values Arthur spent his life practicing: humility, opportunity, dignity. Thousands of lives eventually benefited from programs funded through the estate. Meanwhile, Daniel's life moved in the opposite direction. The relationship with Vanessa collapsed completely. Friends distanced themselves. Business opportunities disappeared. His reputation suffered. Not because Arthur exposed him, because his own choices eventually caught up with him. Vanessa faced similar consequences. The friendship she traded for personal gain could never be recovered. The trust she once enjoyed disappeared. And for years afterward, people remembered her not for her successes, but for the decisions that destroyed relationships she once claimed to value. Yet the story was never truly about Daniel, or Vanessa, or even $18 million. It was about a grandfather who saw what others missed. A man everyone underestimated. A man who understood that character reveals itself slowly, then all at once. Years later, Emily visited Arthur's grave on a quiet autumn afternoon. The maple tree above him had grown larger. The wind moved gently through its branches. She placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and stood there silently, thinking about everything that had happened, thinking about everything he had protected her from, thinking about the final lesson he left behind. Because in the end, Arthur Bennett's greatest inheritance was never his fortune. It was the truth. And sometimes the truth is worth far more than $18 million. As Emily turned and walked away from the cemetery, she carried something she hadn't possessed in a very long time. Peace. The kind that comes when betrayal no longer controls your future. The kind that comes when you finally understand who truly belonged in your life. And the kind that comes when the people who underestimated you realize, far too late, exactly what they lost. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, subscribe, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned.